Okay, so I see we have a couple of people still joining in, but I think we should get started. So first, good morning, everyone. I want to welcome you to today's webinar, which is focused on helping to remove barriers to opportunity, conducting OCAT appraisals for clients with criminal backgrounds. My name is Janetta Deppa, and I am an OCAT team member and will be moderating this presentation today. And I'm also joined by our two speakers, Sydney Reese and Emily Bell. Today's talk will focus on how to best support clients with criminal backgrounds, including those coming out of recent incarceration, who often face significant employment barriers. Working with these individuals, as you know, requires a level of sensitivity and understanding of the unique stigmas, challenges, and constrained choices they face, often on a daily basis. Today, we will provide an overview of this reentry population and the criminal justice system. This will include a walkthrough of all of the challenges, stigmas, and considerations these individuals face while reintegrating and reestablishing their identity back into society. We also will be covering briefly the current state of incarceration in this country and what exactly having a criminal background means and can look like. Finally, we will provide some actionable steps and considerations that case managers and all county staff can take to better provide holistic case management practices. Okay, so first, just a couple of words about logistics before we get started. So our speakers are going to present for about 45 to 55 minutes, and after that, we are going to turn the floor over for a Q&A session. So if you'd like to ask a question, please type it into that question box, which is on the lower right-handed side of your screen. If you think of a question during the presentation, just go ahead and put it in, as the presentation is rolling, and we will be gathering all of those as they come in, and then we'll, do our best to address all of these questions at the end. Okay, so again, right before we begin, we'd like to take a moment or so and just get a better idea of everyone who's listening in today. So you can find the questions for this poll on the box in the left-handed or right-handed side of your screen. If you click the word poll, which is in a dark gray box, it will give you a drop down and show the question that we'd like you to answer. And I will also go ahead and start this poll as well. So just the main question we'd like to know is what best describes your position today? Give a couple of minutes for that, or moments for that. Okay, seems like we have most people who have answered, so we can share the results of that. It seems pretty overwhelmingly, we're joined mainly by case managers, some supervisors as well, and some other, which is also interesting. So glad we have a couple of diverse perspectives today as well. All right, so I'd like to also introduce you to our speakers and talk for a moment about why they are here today. So first, Ms. Sydney Reese is an educator, case manager, mindfulness-based stress reduction teacher, mediation teacher, and mentor. Sydney works with adults and teens, homeless youth, and adults suffering from trauma, relapse, and mental health issues. She currently works with formerly incarcerated women as their employment social enterprise associate with a New Way of Life reentry project. Ms. Reese is a trained and highly practiced facilitator of group processes, diversity and inclusion, recovery and complex trauma, trained through programs at UCLA, the University of Massachusetts School of Medicine's Oasis Teacher Training Institute, Insight LA, Spirit Rock, and Ruth King's Mindfulness of Race teachings. Sydney is also an educator with almost 20 years experience teaching English language arts and social justice advocacy, both nationally and internationally. We also have Emily Bell with us today. Emily is the project director at Project 180. She holds a master's degree in social work and a master's degree in international affairs from Columbia University. She completed her graduate field training with the New York City Department of Education and the Legal Aid Society's Criminal Defense Division in Manhattan. Committed to social justice issues, she has worked in both the nonprofit and public sectors internationally and domestically in the areas of mental health, community development, and education. So we also have 5 learning objectives that we are hoping to accomplish today during this webinar. I'm going to do my best to be brief with these. These learning objectives are to understand the facts around the US population with criminal records, to understand how to better communicate with these individuals, and to better understand the culture of corrections more generally. We are also hoping that you walk away today being able to better identify support structures and questions that can be used when practicing holistic case management with these individuals, and to identify how to reduce the opportunity to cause secondary trauma while posing sensitive questions to these men and women. So now, this is my favorite part of the presentation for me because it means I get to stop talking. So Sydney and Emily, I'm going to pass the torch to you.
Great, thank you. This is Emily. I'm going to start with a brief overview of the justice system, particularly types of crimes, types of criminal institutions, correctional institutions, and then types of supervision. So thanks for having me today. So just a brief overview of misdemeanor and felony crimes. I know that that's one of the questions in the questionnaire. So a misdemeanor crime is a crime that's punishable by up to a year of confinement, and you serve a sentence for a misdemeanor crime in a county jail, not a prison. And it's a crime that might be punishable for up to about $1,000. A felony crime is deemed more serious than misdemeanors, and they carry a possible incarceration of 1 year or more. Some counties have folks serving prison sentences, felony sentences in a jail. Those are going to be low-level felonies, and most felonies are served in the prison, so those are for more serious felonies. And there are some crimes called wobblers, which can be tried as misdemeanors or felonies, and that's really up to the prosecutor in terms of what they want to go after. So jails. Often I notice that folks don't always know the difference between prison and jail, so it's an important distinction that I wanted to cover. Jails are run by the county, so we're in Los Angeles County. The sheriff department runs our local county jail system. That's usually the same in most counties. The main purpose of jail is for short-term stays. So you have an example here of the type of inmate populations, that they're folks that are awaiting arraignment, unable to post bail, they're awaiting trial, or they're in the process of a trial. You have some parole violations, but mainly it's meant for short-term stays. And if you talk to folks that have been incarcerated, you'll hear a lot of difference between jails and prisons. Prisons are really set up, excuse me, for longer-term stays, and jail isn't. So it's less, I don't want to say enjoyable, but it's really not a pleasant place to be, more so than a prison. So. State prisons, so that when we talk about the incarcerated population in the United States, most of the folks are in state prisons. So federal is quite small in the scheme of things, and jails are a little bit smaller. The bulk of the population of incarcerated folks are in state prisons. So those are funded by the state. In California, they're run by the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. And the purpose, again, is for longer term stays. So they're set up for that. There's a little bit more programming than you'll find in the county jails, for example, although not a lot. There's less inmate movement, so you have folks that are there for a year or more. And the inmate population is folks that are convicted and sentenced to prison on a felony charge, and they're mostly charges that have been classified as serious in terms of their type of offense, whether it's violent or sex or just some other kind of serious offense. And then also parole violations are sometimes sent to prison. So federal prisons, again, this is a fairly small percentage of the folks that are incarcerated, but those are prisons that are run by the federal government. Folks that are in there are convicted of a federal crime. So most crimes are both crimes at the state and federal level. Of course, you do see some discrepancies with marijuana, for example. But usually what the feds take on are crimes that are really specifically federal, so something across state lines, something on federal property like a national park or an office, a federal office. If the crime is against a system regulated by the federal government, so that would be banks, a lot of financial crimes are going to be federal crimes. And I have some examples of those sort of things. But again, this is sort of a smaller population of the inmate or the folks that are incarcerated. It's really in the state prisons that you're going to see the bulk of people.
Good morning, everyone. This is Sydney chiming in this morning. Thanks for having me. So one of the things I'd like to encourage us to know is we're doing a lot and may not be aware that we are. And we're doing a lot with the right heart and the right kind of energy to help folks continue their rehabilitation and continue reentry in a very, very positive way. So give yourselves credit for that. And if you need a little bit more to know how well you're doing, Brian Stevenson, who was the force behind the lynching museum in Alabama recently, and also wrote a beautiful book called Just Mercy. He's spoken a lot about what's necessary to change the criminal justice system in America. And he asks us to get proximal, get close to it, rather than just hearing about it in the news, really try to do a deeper dive and really try to understand how these men and women came to be incarcerated, but what it's like also leaving and what are the barriers and the challenges. Two, to be willing to change the narrative. And this is what we're all doing on this call today. All of us who are in this line of work, we already have this willingness to change the narrative, to open our minds and see things differently and work with reframing. Third is remain hopeful. Even though Emily is taking us through this systemic weight, what's really interesting is to just keep hope alive with each individual person and with your intervention. And also with that, this willingness to be disturbed, there's going to be some uncomfortable times, some uncomfortable conversations, some uncomfortable interventions. It doesn't mean you're doing everything wrong, and it doesn't mean that that relationship is lost. So Brian Stevenson really suggests, if you haven't learned about his work, very compassionate view of what we do.
Thank you, Sydney. So I'm going to go over types of supervision now, community corrections. This is going to be obviously very relevant to the work that you guys do. It's with understanding people's current requirements of supervision, some of the hoops they have to jump through. So county probation is probably what you'll find the bulk of people are on if they're on a type of supervision. So county probation is a department within the county, and it can be for misdemeanor or felony convictions. So you can be on probation for a misdemeanor, you can be on probation for a felony. Most probationers are sentenced to probation in lieu of incarceration. So that's something that is determined at the time of sentencing. Some people serve a split sentence, meaning they serve a little bit of time in jail and then they're on probation. Some folks are just going to serve some jail time and they won't be released on probation, and some are just going to be placed on probation. So it's a pretty wide net of people. And the conditions can vary. The shortest I've seen is a year, and it can be up to 5 years, which is a pretty long time to be on supervision. That's quite a challenge for people to be on for 5 years, but it can be up to 5 years. So there's different types of probation. And again, this is determined at the time of sentencing. So formal probation is when you're reporting to an officer monthly. I think the bulk of people are going to be on formal probation. There's also these other types, though, that are worth mentioning. Formal non-reporting probation. This is used sometimes in specialty courts where the clients are reporting directly to a judge, and so they're not reporting to an actual officer. So it's formal non-reporting. And then informal probation, also known as summary probation sometimes, is when there's no assigned officer, but you report to a judge directly, or there's a kiosk that you check into electronically, basically. So that's the lowest form of probation in terms of the amount of supervision, in summary or informal probation. And then PRCS, post-release community supervision, is a type of formal probation, but it was created after realignment in 2011 as a new type of supervision. So realignment's a whole nother topic of conversation, but basically this is important to know that people might say I'm on AB 109 supervision or AB probation. What they mean is it's this new sort of carved out part of supervision that was created after realignment. And this is a little bit shorter. It can be anywhere from 180 days to 3 years. But it's very similar to formal probation, basically.
Thanks, Emily. So one of the things that's really interesting as we start to interact with formerly incarcerated folks is to kind of feel into the impact of this probation and or parole stipulations on their lives. And so the relationship established with the parole and probation officer unfortunately tends to carry over from that hierarchical structure that creates this second-class citizenship with the folks at reentry. It started in prison and in jail, and it tends to continue on. So mentorship is the key, a kind of warm mentorship when we're working with reentry populations, and I'll talk to you more about this a little bit later with a short exercise to kind of show that support at all times, no matter what you're seeing, if it's a misstep, if it's something that's a mistake or going against policy, whatever the issue is, that it's support that's needed. There are many reentry stressors, and it's important to see these, and we'll talk about these a little bit more later, to recognize them and take this compassionate view. I just want to say here that so often when a formerly incarcerated, or I call them returning citizen, has a misstep or makes a mistake, or there's some sort of emotional pop on the job, or some sort of a time and attendance issue, we can very quickly go, oh, it's recidivism. They're going back. They're backsliding. Maybe not. Maybe it's just learning about what flexibility and autonomy and freedom really is. So reentry is a really long process that doesn't just stop once the person is placed in a job. I tend to find with what I do that once the placement happens, there's many more stressors that arrive because the learning curve is much steeper. And so the women and men continue to be affected by reentry years later, 8 to 10 years out. So we'll talk more about this later as well.
Great, thank you, Sydney. So just to continue on different types of supervision, again, I think most of the folks that you'll talk with that are on supervision are probably on county probation, but parole is another one that you'll find, and that's run by the state. So parole is for people that were serving a prison sentence and were released from prison. So you won't be on parole if you haven't gone to prison, basically. So you won't see anybody on parole that only served county jail time, for example, or didn't serve any time, was just placed on probation. So parole is really reserved for folks coming out of prison. And the length of supervision is a little bit longer. It tends to be 3 to 5 years. The lowest I've seen is 3. And then federal probation, again, a fairly small population of the folks on community supervision, but they're people that are either sentenced to federal probation on a federal crime or released from federal custody. So if they say they're on probation, it's worth kind of knowing what type of probation they're talking about, if it's federal or county. And then parole is going to be a whole different thing as well. So just a quick overview in terms of the numbers we're talking about. The U.S. has the highest per capita rate of incarceration in the world. So this is more than places we think of as having other high incarceration rates like China or Russia. The U.S. is by far has the highest rate per capita of incarceration in the world. So out of everybody incarcerated in the whole world, the United States has 25% of that population. It's way out of proportion to the number of people we have in the United States. So it's a huge problem. It's, again, it's the highest rate in the world. There's 2.3 million people incarcerated in the U.S. This was from 2018, so it might be a little different, but that's, you know, a huge number of people. There are over 1,000, close to 2,000 state prison facilities in the country. 33 of those are in California. So California just by itself has 33 state prisons. And those are holding up to 1.3 million inmates nationwide. There's 102 federal facilities. So again, that's, you know, it's a smaller amount of people in federal facilities, about 225,000. And those include both federal prisons and jails. There's about 1,800 juvenile correction facilities, so those tend to be smaller, which makes sense, holding close to 50,000 people. And then there's over 3,000 local jails. And then you'll see this 3.7 million on probation nationwide, so that's huge. You know, it's bigger than the number of people incarcerated. So there's a lot of people in our society on probation. And then there's close to 1 million on parole. So when you look at the incarcerated population, you're talking about state prisons mostly. When you're looking at community corrections, there's a lot of people on probation. So altogether, there's over 6 million either incarcerated or on some sort of supervision, which is a huge percentage of the population.
Thanks, Emily. It's every time I see those statistics, I can just feel the weight of it. And with that, just want to encourage that there's so much more right with you and your work than there is wrong. This is also a quote that I used often and still use with the people who I work with, to remind them, you know, the system is very burdensome, but there's so much more right with them than there is wrong. And this is from John Kabat-Zinn, who started mindfulness-based stress reduction and helping people who couldn't be healed by the doctors that they were seeing. And this is kind of what we're doing here too. We're taking on this challenge to help folks re-enter and return into society. And so what we're talking about for the rest of this webinar today is just how to grow our sensitiveness. And I like the word sensitiveness rather than sensitivity. You know, the compassion and the ability to really have empathy with this population and really see them and create more spaciousness for you in your day-to-day interactions with them, and also with the employee through reframing. And with reframing, we can talk about deconstructing the criminal charge. And I can get into that a little bit. Maybe I'll hold off on for a bit later. There's a huge disparity in who's charged with a violent crime versus a non-violent charge. If you just don't mind, let me take a little bit of time here. So deconstructing a criminal charge, you may not know the person's criminal charges, and I actually think that that's good. But what I'd like you to know is that everyone who is charged for something, it may not mean exactly what we think. For example, I work with women, domestic violence. That woman pops after a number of years and turns around and kills her mate. It's not a premeditated murder. To call her a murderer may not exactly make sense when you look at stress and how stress is. It's fight, flight, or freeze. And Peter Levine has let us know with this group of women, there was nothing premeditated about it. The oppression of her system and her children and what was happening in that home, she popped and then unfortunately killed her mate. So it's really interesting to understand that and hold that charge that's very weighty in a different type of reframing. Also, violent versus nonviolent charges. There was a woman, two women came in, one was white, one was black. They had the same exact charge. They both killed their spouses, but the white woman was given 11 years less and only put on probation for 8 years. The black woman was given 16 years to life. Same exact crime at the same exact age. So it's really quite interesting to see these things. And also to really know that the generational impact of poverty is really a lot of what's driving these nonviolent crimes, and also the disparity and education levels and many other things. So when we know that, we can really privilege and honor what's working with that individual. So we'll talk more about that later. So here's something. The OCAT questionnaire is huge. And so I just want to offer a little bit of reframing here. Please try this on for yourself. I'm sure this is not a one size fits all, but here's a really interesting moment with the questionnaire. So it's talking about legal barriers, and this is actually a pretty beautiful and compassionate moment in the questionnaire, but the way that it is given here is really quite interesting. So here's the beauty. We know that you may be facing legal barriers, but notice it's so small, that first sentence. Sometimes having a criminal record can make it harder to get a job. Absolutely can. And then it goes into questions. Have you seen these on job applications in the past? It looks very much like what Ban the Box was trying to get rid of. It's actually illegal now to ask if you have a criminal record and if you have a criminal background. But these questions that then follow after a very compassionate one in the beginning turn into what looks like the same old questions to take you out of a job. So I'm wondering, what would it be like if when we came to this frame of asking the question, if we started with and really highlighted, hey, it can be really difficult to get a job if you have a criminal background. And if you do have a criminal background, would you be interested in help expunging your record, going to the bottom first and explain? And the way that we know what to expunge, if you're interested is what type of offense did you have? Do you have any upcoming court dates? And often folks may not know if they have outstanding fines, warrants, restraining orders. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But there's a way to reframe this question that can make it more compassionate and less traumatizing. I hope that lands. I'd be interested to hear if you try this, how it works. So.
So I wanted to just include what it's like to be on supervision, so people understand some of the restrictions and things that our folks are required to do or can't do. So this is just sort of a typical person on probation, county probation. So you're going to have monthly in-person reporting. So that's one time a month. That's set by your probation officer. You have to go to the probation office and meet with your officer. Sometimes it's a long wait, and that's really all on the PO's schedule. So if you have work, if you have a conflict, those usually are not so easy to reschedule or cannot be rescheduled. So it's really that's a very important meeting. You have to get there and back on your own, so transportation can be an issue. There's often supervision fees, like people actually have to pay a fee because they're on probation. I don't have a number off the top of my head, but there's usually a requirement of some sort of probation fee that a judge would have to waive. So most folks are required to pay that. We often see requirements for classes like drug and alcohol education, anger management, domestic violence. All of these sessions have some fee. The lowest I've seen is $25. They can be up to $75 per session, and they're usually weekly. So that's quite a financial burden for somebody who's newly released and doesn't have a job yet. And again, they have to get to those get to and from, and they have to pay at the time of taking the class. Folks are often required to attend self-help meetings like Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous. So those are, sometimes I want you to go to 3 meetings a week. Again, so they have to, show a sign-in sheet that they went. 3 meetings, 2 to 3 meetings is pretty standard. That's, again, two or three more things that you have to make sure you can get done. You have to have permission to leave the county or the state. So if you're on county probation, you need permission to leave the county. If you're on state parole, you can't leave the state without permission. you need permission to move residence, so that your officer needs to know where you're living at all times. So oftentimes you're not allowed to move until you get their approval ahead of time. And you can really get into trouble if you move without letting them know. So you can just see all these like various ways of asking permission and being required to do things. You'll have unannounced visits to your home or work by your officer sometimes, so that can be a problem with if you're living with other people and they don't want officers coming around, that can create conflict. You can have location or GPS monitoring, so you're not allowed to be outside of this area, you have to stay away from this area. So that's another way of tracking. There's sometimes employment restrictions. Sometimes an officer might say, I don't want you working in a medical clinic. It's usually related to the type of offense, but that's something that they can do. They can say, I won't allow you to work in a certain type of setting, or I want all of your employment to be approved by me. There's often random substance use testing, so that's sometimes a hotline you have to call the night before, and they tell you if you're required to test the next day. Again, it's not something that you can plan for. You have to get there on your own. It's another barrier. And then there are some housing subsidies that don't allow people on supervision to cohabitate, so that can be a problem with returning home to loved ones. If they have a Section 8 voucher and you're on supervision, you're not supposed to live there. So there are a whole host of resources that are excluded from people as well. So just a little bit more about stigma. This is what, just for my work with people in the system, this is what I hear people saying, that they feel like they're perceived this way because they have a criminal record. Being a bad person, being, not having a morality, a moral compass, someone to be feared, so they're used to people being sort of scared of them, feeling that they're dangerous, that they're not to be trusted. Someone not worthy of help and resources. Again, some resources are specifically excluding folks with records or on supervision. So that's communicating that they're not worthy of that help, right? They're not as worthy as other people. Also that maybe they're a lost cause. Someone's been in and out of the system for a long time, and what's going to change? Like, this person is sort of beyond help, is something that I hear. And then there's, of course, particular stigma around offenses that are classified as violent, sexual, or offenses against children, which I know Sydney has some experience with for sure with her women. But those are particularly stigmatized and can be dangerous for people in incarcerated settings, that those sometimes are the folks that are preyed on the most or are at the most risk of violence from other inmates.
Thanks, Emily. So when I was thinking of stigma, I just typed in, this is a screenshot from my computer, what words do you use other than felon? Because I was looking through some of the wording. So it's interesting what we call our potential candidates. But I love it. You put in felon, and these are all the words that come up, and they're all stigmatizing, aren't they? Including the term loser, which I think is so interesting. And so for me, the question that I ask for us to ask ourselves is, and this is one of those ways we can change the narrative, is, how long do you pay for a crime or misstep? And I always ask people, think of the worst thing you've ever done, the most embarrassing, horrible thing you've ever done. How often and how much and how frequently would you be able to deal with someone bringing that up to you all the time and it following you around? So one of the greatest ways that Susan Burton has taught us, for those who work with the formerly incarcerated, is what we name it. What we name folks actually creates the energy. So we don't use the term felon or convict. We don't use any of these terms. We use formerly incarcerated, returning citizen, someone with a criminal background. If in fact, and even it's encouraging for you when they call themselves a felon to think about going, hey, how do we loosen that up? You've done your time. You've paid for that offense. You're a returning citizen. You're formerly incarcerated. But these words, to continue to carry them and using them, also help generate the stigma as well. So another reframing moment, something to think about. This is a question about childcare, and something that's interesting. And again, as Emily stated, I work with women. This can be the same for men, but many of the women have reunification criteria or stipulations. They've been gone for a number of years, and they're reunifying with their children and really want to come back and be the mother. Stop and think about it, however long they've been, if it's 2 years to 21 years, and even if it's a family member who has taken over custody and raising the child, that child is calling another woman mom. And so she's trying to come back into this, her children's lives. And so when we look at this child care question, I really love the questions here that they're asking. And this particular individual said too far from work or home. So one of the things to really think about with women, any parent who's trying to be active in their children's lives is they have certain criteria, stipulations regarding their children. So if they show up late 3 times to pick up their child from childcare, this can count as a parole offense. So sometimes women will leave their job suddenly or can appear as being uncooperative to stay or work late, but it's actually not that. So this is not them being uncooperative. This is a woman trying to adhere to strict parole stipulations to reunify with her family. So this is something for us to be aware of if we're noticing this kind of rigid behavior around childcare, or if she ticks other, she might not be able to articulate exactly the pressure that she's under to get those kids on time. But it's something for us to remember. When we speak about education, I was reading through this, and this particular individual said no to a lot of things, but I'm sure that you come across people who say yes to many more of these 15 questions about education. And what I've learned when asking about early childhood learning strategies and trends is it really doesn't tell me very much if this person is intelligent or not. What it actually really speaks to me about are what are known as ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. If there was a parent who was formerly incarcerated, if there was mental illness with one of the parents, if food stability and housing stability was an issue, if there is some sort of abuse. Many times, formerly incarcerated folks have not had formal education, and it starts in that young life, one with poverty, particularly quite a bit with women. But what we notice with women is there's a phenomenon of parenting. What that means is that there was an adult who was sick in the home, and that young girl ended up parenting her parent. And so therefore she forgoes her own education to take care of the kids at home who are younger than her and the parents. So there's many reasons why education may not have been as streamlined, but to begin to think about the deeper ways as to why that might have been interrupted, and that interruption does not necessarily mean that she is not intelligent, capable, or smart. And this is where the one-on-one mentoring can do a phenomenal job at shortening that gap of years of being uneducated, because formerly incarcerated women, I find, tend to learn very, very quickly and work very, very well in a mentor relationship. So when we begin to understand what returning citizens are up against, we too can start to change that stigma. It will even change inside our own bodies as we're working with them. We start to appreciate the strength and the resiliency of these women and men. I often, think, gosh, how would I have handled just half of what some of the women who I work with have dealt with? Who would I be today if I had to survive that? one of the other things, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, is to not create an altar to trauma. I'll talk more about that a little bit later. There's a way to hold trauma and difficult life experiences without swooning into feeling that people are somehow less able to handle the stress on the job or the time demands of a job or deadlines. You are more, Susan Burton always says to the women, you are more than what happened to you. Discover the woman who survived that and let her lead your life. So when we're dealing with formerly incarcerated people, it's just a gentle reframing within ourselves. Am I trying to deal with the person who made the mistake, or am I dealing with the person who's out here new, re-entering life, beginning again? And that's even a different energy when I even begin to start to interact or train or counsel that person. So substance use and abuse is a huge coping mechanism and strategy with this population. And the alcohol and drug section is very long and very, very detailed. This is a very wonderful discussion. I think we could have a whole webinar just on this. But the questions in and of themselves, I'm wondering how you're finding that they're actually answering them truthfully. So what I do when we talk about drugs and alcohol, before we even get to the questions or before we have to get to any testing, I don't know if you UA any of your folks, but it's just to kind of say, hey, listen, I want to support you. And if you need any support whatsoever around sobriety, please let me know. A great way to do this is to simply ask, how's your sobriety going? Are you feeling, confident about that? Take a look at these questions and tell me where you fall in them. And one of the things that's so interesting here is many of our folks are feeling very conflicted now that marijuana is legal. And so there's a way to frame that discussion as well. And I simply say, I understand it's legal. Alcohol is legal too, but you can hurt a lot of people driving drunk or working drunk. I just want to make sure that everyone's safe and that we're in a safe environment. Again, coming from that support at all times rather than judgment.
Thanks. So Sydney's already mentioned some of these, but it's worth explicitly stating them that our folks aren't used to having their strengths pointed out. So as much as you can to highlight the strengths that they demonstrate. We've already talked about resilience a little bit, perseverance, adaptability, and resourcefulness. So those are the kind of universal strengths that I see in our folks that are good to remember and worth highlighting when you see them, because again, they're, with the stigma, they're used to not being thought of as folks with strengths. So, but this is what we always see is how resilient and how people can adapt and how resourceful they are. So I know we're kind of running out of time, so I don't want to spend too much time on this, but there is a psychologist, Dr. Craig Haney, who's done a lot of research around the psychological impact of incarceration, and it's very relevant for reentry and what happens when folks get out. So I did want to highlight some of these things. Basically, people can become institutionalized, and that's a process by which any of us would adapt to a new environment. So it's a natural human process, and we're attempting to stay safe and get our needs met in the best way we can in the environment that we're in. So for folks that go into an incarcerated setting, it's in their survival to adapt to that environment and to try and stay as safe as they can. It creates, being incarcerated, being in that setting creates ways of thinking and behaving that are natural and normal adaptations to that setting, but can be dysfunctional when you're outside of that setting. So reentry is a part of trying to adapt to a very different setting, and some of the things that you've been doing to stay safe and get your needs met are not going to work. in the same way. So that's a part of reentry, is making those adjustments. Institutionalization can happen faster with younger folks. So if you're working with transitional age youth, 18 to 25, or people that were in the system at a young age, because younger folks don't have an identity that's as cohesive as adults, they internalize this a lot quicker. And so you're going to see some of these things, even if they've served less time, if they were involved from a young age in juvenile camps and in jails, that process of institutionalization happens a lot faster. So I'm just going to go over a few kind of the big examples of the psychological adaptations that take place from being incarcerated. There develops a dependence on institutional structure and external contingencies. So those are like punishments, basically. So people's behavior, they really model it or they control it based on what the structure of the institution is and what the punishments are. So you'll see a lack of freedom and autonomy, and a decrease in self-initiative, sense of responsibility, and an independent decision-making. So I underlined some things that I think are particularly relevant for your work in terms of self-initiative, responsibility, and that decision-making, that they didn't have that, right? They didn't have freedom or autonomy to do those things. They're used to an external structure of boundaries and limits and consequences. So again, you're controlling your behavior based on some of those external structures and potential consequences. Prisons and jails generally are not safe environments. So you can see people that are hypervigilant, have a lot of interpersonal distrust and suspicion. Again, they're living in an unsafe environment where weaknesses are exploited. And so it leads to this real sense of personal distrust and suspicion, which is functional in an unsafe environment. But folks can develop this real tough persona that tries to keep people at a distance to avoid being victimized. It also means that they isolate, though, and so they're not building relationships. And so you'll see people isolating as a precaution, again, against being victimized. So that's a safe thing, that they're trying to keep themselves safe. And then again, you see younger folks are more likely to employ aggressive strategies rather than older ones. That's just a difference that happens when people are in the system when they're a little bit younger. So emotional over-control and alienation, psychological distancing. So you're constantly worried about this tough persona and how others perceive you. So it can lead to a lack of kind of authenticity, or you have very calculated responses to things because you're used to thinking about things so carefully. We call it kind of like a prison mask, basically. But it affects relationships, right? So there can feel like there's this lack of authenticity. There's some alienation, social distancing. And again, that goes back to that general view of relationships as risky and unpredictable. And that can make it hard as a helper. But understand that that's part of what that can look like. And then social withdrawal and isolation, again, this is a way of staying safe, to really fly under the radar, be sort of invisible. It can look like clinical depression, but it's not. Sometimes, it's really a way to stay safe. And sometimes that feels safer than trying to put on this mask, this tough mask. And you see this more with longer-term prisoners like lifers who've served a long time. They try to just sort of stay out of things, and there's a lot of withdrawal and alienation that can take place. So the incorporation of norms and inmate culture. So I mentioned there's some programming in prisons, but there's not a ton, and so there's a lack of meaningful ways to spend your time often, and so they aren't really given a cultural alternative. So people adapt the norms of prisons. Again, this is just part of adapting to your new environment. So there can be an incorporation of exploiting others, being hyper-masculine for male prisoners, frowns on weakness and vulnerability, discourages the expression of emotion and intimacy, and again, highly values interpersonal respect and personal space. So that's something to know. I see a lot, especially with our male reentry folks, is this really, really a sensitivity around being treated with respect and having physical space. And so that's something that we really pay attention to when we get new clients, is that's often something that staff really have to navigate and make sure they're, really showing respect and not getting too physically close to people. So it can lead to impulsive overreactions to things that seem small to us, but aren't to the individual. So, there can be a sensitivity to sort of being provoked that again, we wouldn't necessarily expect. But it can create really significant barriers to reentry for building the relationship with helpers, having social support, and accessing help and services. I think this is the last one for this, but there's also a real diminished sense of self-worth and personal value. So in incarcerated settings, you don't have privacy rights. You don't have any control over any part of your life, really. You don't have control over who is in your cell with you. You don't have control over anything, really. So you live in pretty cramped and deteriorating physical spaces. Inmates talk about feeling infantilized or degraded often. And so there's really a degradation of self-worth and personal value that can happen as people are in those settings. He also noticed that there's, being incarcerated can be traumatic, and there's often can look the same as PTSD when people come out of incarcerated settings. You see this, the hypervigilance I've already talked about, but there's also a high prevalence of childhood trauma among people in the system. So they already have a trauma history, and then they're coming into incarceration and can often be re-traumatized. So the harsh, dangerous, punitive environment is really re-traumatizing for people that already have a trauma history. So the challenges of reentry, really have to do with that interpersonal distrust. The beginning of reentry, when that external structure is gone, it can feel very chaotic for people and very stressful. And again, they're particularly sensitive to things that are unexpected or unplanned because they were coming from such a controlled environment. So those are just things to kind of know about that early stage of reentry that really can matter for people who are trying to get some help.
So what's most important, thank you, Emily. I so appreciate hearing about those symptoms and what it can look like in prison and what comes out of prison. And it for the women, it's much the same. But what's learned can be unlearned. And that's the beauty I feel of the role that I have and that we have as folks who are now going to do case management, supervise, or employ these individuals. And also know how beautiful it is that in light of everything that Emily just shared with us, what is the moment of hope? What is the neutral ground? Work. A consistent, kind of stable, clear work environment. And many folks really want to work. So being incarcerated is like growing up in a different country. It really, really is. It's a completely different culture. And we can have cultural awareness around it, those of us who are helping, but also our formerly incarcerated folks are very clear that it's a totally different culture. Jacques Verdun, who works in San Quentin, who's been there for many years, he works in the Guiding Rage into Power program, GRIP. Hurt people, healed people, heal people. Formerly incarcerated folks heal formerly incarcerated folks. This is what I say. But you and I, as allies and advocates, we can help build rapport and encourage healthy engagement by being aware of the things that Emily just shared with us. And again, not building an altar to it and offering meaningful work. So support at all times. This is going to be a little awkward in this webinar environment, but I really like for each of us to try it. Ball up your fist as tight as you can. You're balling that fist up tight, 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 tight. And inside your mind, you're saying all the things that no one ever hears. No one's ever going to hurt me again. It's never going to go down like that. No one's going to hurt me. Balling up your fist, balling up your fist. Now try to open it with your other hand. Kind of hard to do, huh? All right, get that fist back up there, ball it up tight, say all those things. No one's ever going to hurt me. I'm not going to go through this again, never. I could get into more detail, but you can imagine you're balling up that fist tight. Take your opposite hand, put the palm open, place the back of the balled up fist into the palm of the hand. I'm hoping you're noticing it just kind of automatically begins to open and release. This is what our role is in dealing with formerly incarcerated folks. When we see those big emotion pops, when we hear the cursing, when we hear the loud voices, when we see someone who feels like they're wanting to be invisible or sullen, how do we offer that open palm so that that balled up, tightly wound individual can just begin to release a little bit?
So we're going to kind of end on this, but trauma-informed approaches are, it's a whole thing. There's lots of training around it, and it can be either quite simple or it can be quite complex, but I did want to mention it just because it's incredibly relevant for our population. Like I said, they have tremendous histories of trauma, and then incarceration in and of itself can be traumatizing. So trauma is really an individual trauma results from an event, a series of events, or set of circumstances experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, with lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning. So that's, that's kind of officially what trauma is. And then I want to just touch on a couple aspects of trauma-informed approaches that help when working with our folks. So knowing that trauma can have really serious effects on health, behaviors, relationships, school, work, all aspects of life. It's important for all service providers, and that's very general, anyone in a position of help, to really gain knowledge and skills that help promote healing, recovery, and wellness. So a trauma-informed approach, one of the key principles I'll go over, but it really promotes resilience in both staff and clients or patients. So it works both ways. Some of the key principles include organizational safety, being trustworthy, being transparent, culturally sensitive, having a collaborative approach, and empowerment between staff and clients. So we've already touched on some of that, but in terms of the interpersonal distress that can happen with formerly incarcerated folks, so really being trustworthy, being transparent, being as collaborative and empowering as you can is particularly important. And I like just this reframing of this approach just recognizes the role of trauma and seeks to shift this perspective of what's wrong with you, which is again back to that stigma and labeling, to what happened to you. So I think that just with that lens shift, it can really change how you approach folks.
Thanks, Emily. So a trauma-informed approach can be understanding what door I need to come in from. So the building rapport is really, and I'm just sharing with you what I have found in my working more and more with the population that we're speaking of. But pitch and tone is everything. So for example, coming in and saying, hey, good morning, Miss Emily, how's your day going? That Miss Emily already sets a different kind of tone. Pitch is how I deliver a message. Tone is the way in which all of the energies that I'm containing and holding as I'm communicating something come across. So if we know that folks are coming from a very huge and kind of violent, loud, it's very, very loud in prison and jail. If you got 4,000 women in one place, it's pretty loud. So this pitch and tone can do a lot to signal safety or danger. So just warmth, really, really coming in a collaborative spirit. If something went wrong on the job, rather than coming in with what was wrong, coming in with, hey, tell me what happened yesterday for you. What did you notice? What came up for you? And as they're speaking, truly deep listening. I've really had to learn to not interrupt. I've really had to learn to hold the eye contact, but not in a way that's authoritative, but that's kind of warm and opening. Also think about not responding right away if you have a really kind of pressured situation. And this is really, I think, counterintuitive to our traditional kind of supervisor roles in work situations and work environment. But think about not responding right away. Don't be afraid to pick up a thread of a discussion later, even days later. Remember, these folks did time, so time feels really different for them. Also, as the supervisor, for me, as I make amends quickly, stating that I've learned about the incarceration chasm gap. I am not formally incarcerated, and I always say all the time, I know nothing about being incarcerated. I'm leaving you to teach me that, but I think I might have fell into a hole here and assumed something. And I make apology and amends quickly for something I misunderstood. And that goes a long way in building rapport. Reducing secondary trauma, one of the ways that I'm hoping will be helpful is in reframing some of the OCAT question sections, really maybe bringing in a little bit more human context to it. You know, checking in with, hey, how's it going? Is there anything I can help explain? But it's so important to listen and understand their experiences, particularly their experiences in the new work environment. Another way is to simply ask when something is heated going on, where there's some confusion, where you feel a little heat, hey, what do you need right now? Also, there's something to understand. For me, my life started to work much smoother with this population, where I realized there is no mutual trust. They do not trust me. They do not trust me. I'm an outsider. I don't know. And when I got that, I could then begin to earn my trust over time. Another great question is, how can I support you better? Checking in when there isn't a problem. Another thing is, play it straight. Directness is better. Maybe in our own nervousness, maybe in our own desire to build rapport, maybe we have a lot of joking. I found that that doesn't work so much, particularly around needing to communicate important information. If I just play it straight, warmth, but just straight, it tends to be better. Also, to be consistent in my own personality. So if I am more a facilitator and assister type manager, then that's what I need to stay. The good cop, bad cop, the flipping, the kind of personalities. If you work in a team, it's best that everybody in that team, if you're a hard ass, forgive the language, just continue to be that. But when we flip flop in our personalities and our approaches, it causes great distress for them. And again, Emily already stated, with women as well as men, respect personal space. Always ask if it's okay, do you mind, or not at all. Emily, I think those are yours.
I think so. Yeah, I think we both kind of put some things in here, but there's some really great resources that are, we try to make them like non-Los Angeles specific, but these are just some links to look at, and organizations if you want more information about things. But yeah, really great collection of resources here.
Mm-hmm. And again, I tried to get a different type of mix: books, documentaries, TED Talks, things for you to listen to in the car. I find, again, when Brian Stevenson asks us to get proximal, to get close, one of the greatest ways to do that is to kind of witness the lives of different people coming out of prison and what they're going through. And it really helps me understand more and see those symptoms when I'm working one-on-one with folks. These are resources for your employees that you might know these already. The 211 reentry resources in any county are pretty helpful. Second Call is a beautiful program. The formerly incarcerated people, convicted peoples, and their families movement is really great. We just had a huge convention, Quest for Democracy. The 12-step programs, people find a lot of help and comfort in there. So then there's a daily reflections reader. If you guys could find a collection of inspirational quotes, I think I've given you a resource there. Those quotes really, really help. If you put it on email tags, or you just put it up in the break room, or when you're having to give and go and you can kind of throw out a quote, those pithy little statements really help redirect and bring warmth to individuals that kind of function as a North Star.
Okay, wow. So thank you so much, both Emily and Sydney, for this wealth of information. At this time, we're going to kind of open up the conversation to all of our audience members for Q&A session. So if you haven't submitted a question yet, but you would like to, please type it into that question box again. That's on the right-hand side of your screen. And I'll do my best to address everyone's questions. So I'll take a moment to allow you to type in your questions if you haven't already done so. And also, in the meantime, I had a question for our speakers today based on this presentation. So you spoke that prison, really changes a person's mentality about their own individuality, and it can really really deplete their self-initiative and views of self-worth, and that can extend then, in reentry. So how can case managers better work to kind of encourage and inspire this sense of independence and autonomy again in a positive way when getting them to think about employment or education?
Sydney, do you want to start with that one?
Sure, thanks, Emily. It may look a little different than you think. First of all, allowing folks to meet, know, or you have on the ready formerly incarcerated folks who are already thriving back out into society. So there's some of those resources I gave you are that. The other thing is to really, really talk about the jobs that they had while they were inside, and really pull from those skills. They have great skills, particularly for the folks who are in prison. Everybody has skills, but to really, really talk about those skills and how they can be translated into a great career. Lead with your skills, not with your past. Lead with your skills. The other thing is that when we look at all of those things that are the incredible behaviors that happen in prison, I talk about, hey, you're unthawing, you're thawing out. It's a thaw out. It takes time. Re-entry takes time. It's not a one-hit quitter. It takes time.
Yeah, and I would add just a lot of praise. When you recognize something that someone's doing right, or a challenge that they're facing, to really acknowledge people for those things, and to do it genuinely. I mean, if it doesn't feel authentic, don't do it, because people have a radar for that. But really seeing really looking for moments to praise people. Like, wow, it sounds like you had a really hard time getting here today, with the bus and the rain, or what have you. Thank you so much for making it. It must have been hard. Even simple things like that. So just looking for ways to acknowledge and praise people in an authentic way.
Mm-hmm.
That's beautiful.
Great. Thank you so much. Another question is kind of in that same vein. And so this person says, prison, I understand, changes people's responses and behavior, but also, values respect and self-reliance. So have you found that men and women post-release tend to find certain jobs or being more suitable, or industries? Is there a theme?
Yes, it's interesting with the women, non-traditional work roles, so construction, firefighting, electrical, many of those things are what were done while inside. And so sometimes when she comes out of prison, she doesn't want to do those jobs right now. And what's interesting is those are the majority of jobs that are being offered right now in California, particularly as the Olympics are coming to us in 2028. So it's very interesting to share with her that she got paid $1 a day to do for very breaking labor, she can actually get more money doing now. What I found with formerly incarcerated, there are so many jobs that they have done while inside: hospice work, dental hygienist, chef. I mean, feeding 4,000 people a day, 3 times a day is quite a bit. Custodials, electrical. They have many more skills than they know. But what's interesting is trying to get the credentials or the licensing based on whatever their conviction may be. So she may have 17 years of hospice work, but she actually can't do it once she gets out. So there are ways to help her shift those skills and really become part of society. I haven't seen any jobs that formerly incarcerated people don't want to do. Again, the only thing I've seen is this little bit with the non-traditional work roles for women once coming out. It takes a little bit to help them lift up the value of that work in a different way. But once she gets that paycheck for the difference between $1 a day versus $25 to $36 an hour, she's quickly convinced. So.
It's really interesting to kind of think about how you can spend, so decades of your life doing something and then still not be able to do that post-release, and how those credentials and things work. Thank you for that. Let's see. It's another question that asks, how can case managers find resources to motivate women who have been incarcerated due to violent experiences, such as sex trafficking and domestic violence? They sometimes state that trafficking is all they know since they were children, and they tend to find themselves going back to self-trafficking.
Yes. Yes. This is one that I hold with compassion. One of the things that I always ask folks is, if your past and your convictions had nothing at all to do with anything, we didn't even know about it, and if you had all the money in the world, what is it that you would like to do? And if she can articulate she'd like to own her own business or work with youth, then what I do is I plant that seed and I keep watering that seed. So it's support at all times. I keep supporting her in that dream in a kind of scaffolding way. Not, hey, I can sometimes say, hey, don't forget about, your dream. And she'll go, yeah, Miss Sydney. And I'll go, well, there's a great talk coming up. I've got an Uber pass for you and a Subway card. Why don't you check it out? So just keep encouraging towards that life that's different than the one that she's known. And also, again, don't be afraid to pair her. I work with other folks. So if there's another formerly incarcerated woman who shared her same life and has been out of that for a while, I call that woman and say, hey, do you mind if I give your number to this lady? And maybe the two of you can chit chat. That support goes a long way.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I have one more question for right now. So everybody else, get your keep thinking about questions if you have any. Now's the time. So this last one says, I'm assuming many individuals might have these mental health issues, but might not want to disclose them, or might not even understand these are things they're dealing with in the first place. So what can I do to encourage that clients can open up to me regarding mental health so I can refer them to services?
Yeah. I'm trying to remember from the questionnaire if there are specific places that ask that. I'm guessing there are.
There's
sometimes,
one section.
Yeah.
Oh, there's just a section that asks about if you've previously been diagnosed with mental health issues, or if you've experienced them in the past, and then it can dive into more specifics about depression and anxiety and things such as that. So it asks specifics, but if they might not want to disclose them, I'm assuming that's what that person means.
Yeah. Sometimes I ask it for a little bit sideways, if I'm assessing somebody and they're saying no, but I get a sense that something might be going on. I can sometimes, instead of saying like, have you ever had a mental health diagnosis, you can never say, I say something like, have you ever talked to a therapist before? And then if they say yes, oh, okay, what brought you to that therapist? And then sometimes like kind of working backwards is a way. Have you ever met with a psychiatrist? Have you ever been in the hospital before, and sometimes that's a psych hospital, so yeah, if I'm getting a lot of no's, sometimes it's just like, have you ever talked to a psychologist? Have you ever talked to a therapist? Have you ever found yourself feeling really, really down, and that maybe you would like some help? So kind of getting away from some of the clinical terms like diagnosis helps come at it from a slightly different angle. And then, before asking questions like that, always saying, I'm going to ask you about these things. And really it's to make sure I get you some help if you want it and need it, so that it's not to come up with another diagnosis. It's not to label somebody. It's really like, I'm going to ask these questions because I want to make sure I give you as much, connect you to as many resources as I can. And so if people come in with it, they might be a little bit less suspicious if they know, like, okay, this is really to get me some help, as opposed to, I just have to check these boxes and make sure I cover these questions, and that really it would lead to another referral or, some more help.
And do you mind if I add just a little bit? This is a question for all of us, and each of us has to answer this in our own way. But we have so much information about them. And what I've found is I can't really effectively build rapport because I tend to feel to them like a PO, like an officer or their parole agent, because of that disparity in information about them. So here's where self-disclosure can really maybe work for you. And here it is, willingness to be uncomfortable. And again, this is for each of us to decide. But I'm wondering how effective it is. And it's worked for me to say, hey, listen, a lot of stressing coming home, a lot of stress. I got stress, we all do. Working is challenging. There's a great woman who's helped with anger management. I've had to look at my own issues with anger. I'm in a 12-step program. I just kind of disclose and go, hey, if you need any help with this, let me know. I got some good people for you. Mental health is real. It's real, So the disclosure can be the thing. Remember that open palm with that fist on top that just starts to release a little bit. But the disparity in what we know about them and they're not knowing anything about us, again, this could be a moment to interject a little bit more humanness into that discussion.
Those are fantastic answers. Thank you so much for the give and take as well. One more question now, it's popped up. So this person says, I've been told by persons recently released who have served state prison time that they do not qualify for expungement, but must apply for a certificate of rehabilitation. How can case managers assist with this?
Yeah, Sydney, do you know about the certificate of rehabilitation? I think that's a state level.
Yes, and so there is, with a New Way of Life Reentry Project, we have expungement clinics that they're all free, and our legal department. And you can also call the 211 line to find out exactly how that works and how to get around that. But I believe expungement is available, Emily, please correct me, to everyone. And even if you fill out that certificate, it functions in that way as well, does it not?
I think there are some convictions that cannot be expunged.
Of course.
Yeah. So some people, based on their convictions, just aren't eligible.
Yeah,
but there are.
And sorry, those are the three. So it's sexual assault, murder, and child molestation.
But most people are going to be. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I just did a quick Google search. It looks like different, like the Superior Court of California, so the state court will handle certificates of rehabilitation and pardons. So I just found a packet. But yeah, it is something that's handled at the state level, and it's a court process that they'd have to petition for. But I could do a little bit more research and pass that on. It looks like each county sort of has its own court process.
Stipulation. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And again, going back to the way in which, the crimes are recorded, sometimes, I'm thinking of one case, it was, a child endangerment. The terms of it sound so gruesome, but when you see what happened is the mother was standing outside of the car, and her daughter was asleep inside, and two of her daughters, and one was an infant. And because of the age of the younger one, they got her for child endangerment. So th- there are things to pursue here legally that can overturn even that.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Thank you again. I think those are all the questions that we have. So it looks like we can wrap up to our final slide for today. I'd like to extend a sincere thank you to both you, Sydney and Emily, for sharing with us not only your time, but also your incredible knowledge that you have about working with these individuals and how best to support them moving forward. I'd also like to thank everyone who's participated today on this webinar. For those of you, I know there were a couple people who have asked, but for anyone who's interested, we will publish this webinar slides and the audio recording of this and the Q&A transcripts on the Learning Center page. And there will also be a little quiz there as well if you want to test your knowledge about this information. So this is, again, available on the OCAT Learning Center, which is on the dashboard once you've logged into your OCAT account. So if you have any questions with finding this or needing to locate these resources, please reach out to the OCAT help desk for that. And if you wouldn't mind staying on the line for just one more moment, it's a one question evaluation of today's webinar, we'd really appreciate your feedback with what you've learned today. So I'm going to pull that poll up, and thank you again for everyone who has attended. So this is just to ask. And the poll should be up now. Okay. Thank you, everybody.